Hello and welcome to Father Spitzer's Universe at the intersection of faith and reason. I'm Doug Keck, your host, coming to you from our EWTN studios in the heart of Irondale, Alabama, Mother Angelica Way. And today's topic, is there a hierarchy of truth in the moral order? Last year we talked a little bit about the culture of life. Today we're going to talk about the hierarchy of truths. They're all related. You can email us your questions at spitzer'suniverse at EWTN.com. Post your questions on Facebook at facebook.com/EWTN online, hashtag FSUniverse. And send us a tweet at twitter.com/EWTN, hashtag FSUniverse, for FS, of course, for Father Spitzer. And, of course, don't forget the Magis Center website for all things Father Spitzer, magiscenter.com, of course. And just a reminder for people looking for additional information having to do with the cultural life and the hierarchy of all truth, go to our EWTN website, EWTN.com/vote. We've got a wonderful website, as you can see on our screen, that talks all about the issues that are important to Catholics. You hear a lot of things in the media back and forth, people claiming to speak for the church, but it's good to get some direct information coming from our theology department here at EWTN. And speaking of straight from the horse, we go right out to Father Spitzer from our West Coast studios there in Orange County, California. As you can see, a beautiful location there. Ironic, as they would say, quite ironic. And today we're going to be talking about, again, Father, is there a hierarchy of truth in the moral order? But before we get to exactly what that is exactly, last week we were talking about the culture of life, and this ties into this, but let's talk about when we hear something like this, we hear two things. Sometimes a hierarchy of truth in the church, and there's also something called the seamless garment we've heard as well. And my guess is both of those can be understood in an appropriate way and maybe misunderstood in other ways. Go ahead.
Yes, I mean, with respect to the hierarchy of truth in the moral order, that's basically what theologians refer to as a hierarchy of values, or ethicists refer to as a hierarchy of values. Are some values or goods more important than other values or goods? Or put it another way, which is more commonly the way that it's addressed, are some evils more destructive, or are some evils worse than other evils? And of course, people right away say, well, are you trying to do a greater of two evils calculus? And as a matter of fact, when we get into the political realm, we have no options, really. We do have to get into a calculus of which evils are greater and which goods are greater, because if we don't do that, I mean, we won't be able to come to a decision. So in the political order, we can talk about a limited commensurability of goods or a limited commensurability of value. That just means that we can, in some limited way, compare one good with another good or one evil with another evil to determine, well, which evil is the greatest or which good is the greatest. It can't be a perfect calculus, obviously, because, of course, this is not like a science, or it's not like an empirical subject, right? You're talking about values, but nevertheless, there are some objective grounds for doing this, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in the program. But I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas certainly did believe in a comparability, or that is to say that we can compare different values with one another along the lines of what's called ontological superiority. So we can talk about that. Another way in which this is done is the magnitude, that is to say the number of people who might be harmed by a specific evil. So you've got evils within themselves. Which evil is the worst? Then of course you've got another principle that the more evils there are, the worse that it is. And then the third idea, it comes in with respect to intrinsic evil. So if an action is intrinsically evil versus if an action is not intrinsically evil, but it is kind of morally neutral, but it could have evil effects or good effects. And of course, the main thing there would be for Catholics, as we'll discuss later, I'm sure, is that intrinsic evils are prohibited under any circumstances, because you can't intend them without intending an evil. Whereas, if I have another, morally neutral action that I'm contemplating that could have a bad consequence or could have a good consequence, for example, surgery, it's morally neutral, but of course I could kill the person if it's a very dangerous surgery, or I could save the person's life in the long term, which would be good effect. And of course, that we don't want to say it should be ruled out automatically. Obviously, the person who's doing the surgery, so long as they're doing it for the good effect, even if the bad effect should happen, is still not held responsible. But one who commits an intrinsically evil act, automatically it's an evil, because you can't intend otherwise.
Let me ask you, Father, just for some of us lay people out there, because sometimes we throw around these terms, like intrinsic. I think most people sort of get that idea, but when we say something's intrinsically evil, break that apart for us. Break it down. What do we mean by that?
Evil in itself, the very commission of the act will bring evil into the world, because the act is evil in itself, independently of its effects, independently of its consequences. So essentially, it's the old definition. Malamans say it's evil in itself. The action itself brings evil into the world, whereas another kind of act would be just morally neutral. Means that no, you could do the surgery, right? But you're not committing an evil there by just committing the action or doing the action. Instead, you'd have to the effects will determine, so long as you're intending the good effects, the effects will determine, well, did a good or evil happen, but you're not held responsible for the evil effects.
Right, and I would think also, technically, let's say you were Dr. Mangala and you were doing surgery on people for ill reasons, you know what I mean, in a sense where the surgery itself is morally neutral, but the reason behind doing it may itself be depraved, right?
Oh yeah, that could very much happen. But then in that case, Dr. Mengele would be intending evil effects from it, in which case he would be morally culpable. So that's the difference. But of course, a normal surgeon, is really trying to intend good effects, not evil ones.
Well, at least so far.
And there are many actions.
And that's one of the things we're trying to hold on to, I think, to some degree, is make sure, as we see in what's going on in Europe, the whole euthanasia movement, where you start to move out to whether, whether the medical team is there to help you live a better life or help you into the next world. That's comes a question in people's minds.
Oh yeah, and of course now it's become very morally ambiguous. Now, if you're intending to help somebody commit suicide, that is intrinsically evil. Like abortion would be intrinsically evil. You're literally killing an innocent. That action is going to bring evil into the world in itself. Adultery is intrinsically evil, because that action in itself, right, the breaking apart of the family, the infidelity to the commitment, is bringing evil into the world upon the commission of an act. The same thing with euthanasia. If I'm just even assisting somebody to commit suicide, I'm making it possible for them to commit suicide, that automatically is bringing evil into the world. Suicide is intrinsically evil as well. The commission of the act brings evil into the world. Now, of course, we still have to talk about culpability. Are people culpable, right, for these things? And of course, in the Catholic Church's moral theology, there is, an intrinsic evil that's what's called grievous matter. Right, you can't be committing these things. However, it does require sufficient reflection and full consent to the will, which means no impediments to the free use of the will in order for it to be mortally sinful. So when you talk about intrinsic evil, you're talking about the action. When you're talking about mortal sin, you're talking about the person, whether they're culpable for that sin, whether they're responsible for that sin, or whether the sin actually is committed right? Because if you don't have sufficient reflection, you didn't know that it was intrinsically evil, or couldn't understand it, or there was some impediment to the free use of the will, right? Some psychological impediment, or some impediment with respect to force from the outside. Somebody's compelling you to do it, or another kind of impediment, that could be a deeply ingrained neurosis or habit. Things of these natures could actually present an impediment to the free use of the will. And of course, certain kinds of depression can do that as well, and all of the big psychological disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, etc.
Do you think in the therapeutic world we tend to live in today, that many times people, in an effort to absolve themselves of responsibility, will fall back on, the old devil made me do it, but that idea that I can't really, yes, what I did may not have been right, but there's all these reasons why I did it, and in an effort to absolve themselves of responsibility?
Yeah, I think sometimes, we can try and excuse ourselves. But, if there really is, there was a great book that was written by a guy named Paul Ricoeur, very fine phenomenological psychologist, philosopher, called Freedom in Nature, the Voluntary and the Involuntary. And I think, if we kind of diagnose, there really are states or impediments that render a person somewhat involuntary. They undermine the full consent of the will. And the church uses very strong language there, either full consent of the will or complete consent of the will in the catechism. And so that's a real high bar to get over. So, I suppose one could try and excuse oneself, but, you don't want to discount also a person who really does have some kind of deep depression, psychological disorder, where they are rendered involuntary by something either unconscious or by some kind of coercion from a terrible psychological impediment, or force or coercion from the outside. So, but by and large, that would be the for something to be morally sinful, it would have to have that. But you'd have to be very careful and very authentic in your own examination of conscience.
Right.
If you're going to say, I'm just not going to go to confession, or I'm not going to ask for forgiveness, I'm just not culpable here.
Right.
That would be ridiculous. My
Right.
thought is, when in doubt, go to confession. Whether if something is really grievous matter,
Right.
And you may have had full consent of the will, you really ought to be first asking for the Lord's forgiveness with the intention to go to confession, and then finish up by going to confession.
Okay, very good. Sometimes I wonder if some of us try to avoid hearing too much of what the truth is, because then we feel like we're obligated to follow it. So what I don't know, I don't have to deal with.
Well, that's called culpable ignorance. You can't do that either.
Okay. All right, I got to check that off the list. Okay, here's an email, Father, for you. Okay. Father and Doug, we can agree that prayer is the single most important factor for the citizens of our country in determining our next president. Yeah, prayer is for everything, obviously, here at EWTN. In your opinion, what do you think are other additional ways that we can influence the decision of our fellow Americans so that we make this right decision? Obviously, we can pray for the candidates. We can pray that our country makes the right decision. Are there other things we could do?
Yes, vote, and then try to take out the newly revised Bishop's Voters Guide of 2016, and just take a quick look at the rationale that the bishops are recommending there, for, what I was just talking about, basically, that hierarchy of values or hierarchy of evils in the moral order, because the bishops are certainly pointing the way to certain things being, more worthy of consideration than another. So, in other words, if we want to do as much as we can, prayer is, of course, important, first priority. The second thing is vote yourself, but be an informed voter. Take out that 2016 revised Bishop's Guide, and try to understand it. Try to understand their rationale for why, for example, abortion is an intrinsic evil and why it has to be taken so seriously, and why allowing abortion on a grand scale so that it becomes equivalent to mass murder. I mean, if you believe that the killing of an innocent, right, an autonomous innocent, and you believe that a preborn human being, even at the single-celled embryo stage, is a human being, and you should, because it's a unique human being, which can only be a human being, has mitochondrial DNA, right? Which is only shared by human beings. It has a full human genome at that point. I mean, all the, as it were, software that's going to be needed for this living organism to become who and what he or she is already determined. So, of course, the bishops are saying, hey, this is important. We're talking about an issue of mass murder, and we're trying to cloak it in ambiguities and so forth and so on. So we have to look at what they're trying to say, take it very, very seriously, because they have presented us, at least implicitly, with a set of prioritizations, which we can talk about on this program, later. But those priorities are important. And the third thing we can do to enter into the election is to share our Catholic perspective, right, with other people. And obviously, Catholics have been somewhat successful at sharing a coherent moral perspective about this hierarchy of evils and the intrinsic nature of intrinsic evil of an abortion or of euthanasia and so forth and so on. Because we see that some of the campaigns have already dissed Catholic voters because of their persuasiveness in this regard.
Right, exactly. Well, on that point, we're going to take a break, speaking here with Father Spitzer in his universe about the hierarchy of truths for Catholics to consider, especially in this season of a presidential election in the United States, but things for all of us to consider as Catholics worldwide. Stay with us, much more ahead with Father Spitzer and his universe. Thanks for staying with us here in Father Spitzer's Universe. I'm Doug Keck, talking about the moral order. And from a Catholic perspective, is there a hierarchy of truth when dealing with the moral order, or are all issues the same? I think it's something that many of us confront all the times in our lives, and certainly also around election time. That's why we're asking Father Spitzer, who can be a little more in the know than many of us are, and hopefully clarify for us or bring some clarity to some of these issues or point us in the right direction. I just want to mention our wonderful website, EWTN's website, EWTN.com. You go there, is a new website we just put up, has to do with all the information, the non-negotiables, other things we're talking about on this program. Also, you can always go to Father's website, themagiscenter.com, for all the information that you'll need as well that gets reflected by what we talk about on this particular program. Now, one of the things we're talking about in this hierarchy, there's terms like non-negotiable. Now, going back a few years ago, even our Holy Father, Pope Benedict Emeritus, talked about the idea of, in his mind, life, marriage, family, and authentic human freedom were like his non-negotiables. Others have talked about the idea, I know our theology team has talked about things like the dignity of human life from conception and natural death, the dignity of marriage and family, and the protection of the right of parents to educate their children being a couple of the ones that are non-negotiables. How do you see that?
Right. Well, I think those are all warranted, and they not only come out of our tradition, right, but they also come out of the teachings of Jesus, and they also come out of our reflection, what we call our philosophical reflection and our moral reflection on the teachings of Jesus. So there's a very good reason for those non-negotiables. For example, with Jesus, clearly, the intrinsic goodness of every single human being, right? The intrinsic dignity of every single human being. The least of human beings, right? Whatsoever you do to these least brothers and sisters of mine, you do unto me. I mean, there is no greater statement of the intrinsic and universal dignity, right, of human beings, every human being. And once you see that, we have to defend it. I mean, Jesus is basically giving this to us. I mean, he's also telling us, about adultery. For Jesus, he basically says, look, adultery is a breakup of the marriage, which of course is the foundation of our interpersonal personhood, if I can put it that way. We don't come into the world by ourselves. We come into the world in our family. The family relationship that we have is not just in our physical genes. The family relationship we have is built into us in our environment, in this marriage, and it's the sacred covenant of marriage that guarantees that this kind of interpersonal being, this kind of stability of identity for the children, the stability of the covenant, that's going to be the building block of culture, is going to be vouchsafed. And so we have to remember this, right, as how important marriage is, and the definition of marriage is, especially with respect to the interpersonal identity of every human being and the stability of the family for the children who will be raised by it. So these things are not only built into Jesus' teaching, but we've reflected on this over 2,000 years, and we've come up with a very refined moral theology, which justifies what Pope Benedict was saying, namely, right, that these things are non-negotiables in and of themselves. I mean, you can almost, from St. Thomas Aquinas has a wonderful way of looking at what's called ontological superiority, and that's just a fancy way of saying, you kind of can rank certain evils by the destructiveness that they are going to, that's going to happen, or the quality of destructiveness, degree of destructiveness that will happen if you violate it. So, for example, you can just say, well, the killing of a human life versus the maiming of somebody. Well, what is a worse evil? Yes, killing the whole person is worse than killing part of a person, or maiming part of a person, or injuring part of a person. So you can, again, one has an ontological superiority, I just say a superiority of being over the other, so the destruction of it is more evil than the destruction, than simply the injuring of somebody. Or you can also say, and this comes into our political philosophy, and the way Catholics have absolutely influenced political philosophy. That is to say, the destruction of life is going to be a more important, a worse evil, right, than the destruction of liberty. Why? Because liberty is just a condition of life. Of course it's an ideal condition of life. Of course it's one of the most important conditions of life, to be fully human. But if you destroy the life, right, that automatically means that liberty is impossible, right. By definition. So obviously it's worse to destroy the life than to destroy a condition of life. Mm-hmm. It's worse, to destroy conditions of life that have much greater effect on whether a person can be human or not, right, than one that has a lesser effect on whether one can be human or not. So, right, if I say, well, what's more important, liberty or property, the right to liberty or the right to private property? It's the right to liberty. Mm-hmm. And the reason is, of course, that liberty affects my whole, capacity to be a fully human being, right? If somebody is enslaving me, I have absolutely no humanity left, practically, except what's in the domain of my thoughts and my prayers. Everything else has been taken away. Whereas if somebody says, I'm going to take away your property, but at least you still have some, liberty within your own domicile or within your own family and so forth and so on. That's a very different thing, right? It's a less degree of harm, right? Less evil. And of course, we do this all the time. Our whole political philosophy is filled with, in fact, Francisco Suarez, who was the Jesuit who basically discovered inalienable rights, when he discovers the inalienable rights in his major tractate De Legibus on the laws, he shows that there is a natural hierarchy of rights. I mean, and now he doesn't come out and talk about it that way, but he speaks about the rights in a hierarchical way. And in other words, a life right is more important than what would be called, custody over one's, inner one's self, and a liberty right that we call today. He didn't call it a liberty right, and that's more important than a property right, and so forth. So the key thing, though, is you can always use what's called the necessity criterion. If one if one right is necessary for the very existence of the other right, in other words, the very possibility of the other right, then the first right has to be considered more significant, more fundamental in any rights conflict. So, for example, if the right to life is necessary for the very possibility for the right to liberty, which it is, obviously, if you're dead, your liberty rights are a moot point, right? Then, of course, the life right has to be more significant than the liberty right. And so if it comes to a contest, for example, in Roe versus Wade, right, where we see that it's the privacy right of the mother versus the life right of the preborn child, notice that Roe versus Wade went in favor of the liberty right, which goes completely against any logic of the intrinsic ordering of rights by necessity or the intrinsic ordering of rights by ontological superiority. I mean, it just literally wiped out the objective bases for the hierarchy of rights and the resolution to rights conflict just by the sweep of their hand and a little signature on the pen, and they literally take jurisprudence and ground it into the dirt. So, I mean, it's an amazingly cavalier way, too, in which it's done, pretending as they did that they had consulted with so many people in trying to come to this, this absolutely sophomoric conclusion, which should be within the purview of the justices who have been through both undergraduate and, of course, legal education. Unbelievable.
That was the emanations
that's why we need Catholic.
Right. That was the emanations from the penumbra, right? It's where they pulled that out of, really. And again, another thing where I always think, in a limited way, the idea of the devil was a liar from the beginning. You think here is something that was based on a lie. The actual case itself wasn't even true when it was brought forward. It turned out later that it wasn't even true. And let me ask you with that, you bring up that point, and sometimes we hear that from people, and one of the questions coming up after is going to kind of deal with some of this too, which is the idea that it seems to be that the idea of eliminating a child prior to it being born doesn't seem to be, it may bother me a little bit, but I let people do that. But once that child is here, then the idea that we're supposed to reach out and take care of this child, but it's okay to kill it. But once it's here, isn't it horrible that you're not willing to feed it? Well, but if you kill it, then you don't have to feed it, and then you end up where so many of these things, if you read through them, and sometimes with the climate issues, there's a big part of this that has to do with population control, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Well, there's two issues here, Doug. I mean, one is the striking difference between reality and appearances. And of course, in the law, and not only in the law, but in philosophy, right? In any, certainly in the physical sciences, reality is what counts, not appearances. right? The sun may appear to be rising in the sky, but in point of fact, it is not. The Earth is rotating on its own axis and revolving around the sun. And that is the reality. Now, of course, if you're going to say, well, gosh, that preborn embryo is inside the mother's womb and it's very small and it's quite invisible unless I get an ultrasound or something. And therefore, by all appearances, it would seem to be not really a human being. Or once it's outside of the womb, oh, it's really a human being based on appearances. That's just absolute baloney. I mean, that's just like saying, the sun is rising in the sky and really meaning that that's the reality, right? I mean, it's just such naive, criteria. What do we have to do then to overcome the problem of appearances, the subjectivity of appearances, and the relativity of appearances? We have to develop objective criteria for determining reality. And what could be the objective criteria in this particular case? Number one, is it a living organism? You want to know whether it's human life or not? Is it living? Of course it's a living organism. Is it a human organism? Yes, it is a human organism. It's a human organism because it has the DNA of a human being and only will come out to be a human being with its mitochondrial DNA going back to the Eve gene, our ancestor, woman and common ancestor from 200,000 years ago. Yes, it's only going to be a human being, and it's a unique human being. The full human genome is as unique, more unique than your fingerprint. For all intents and purposes, there's not going to be any other one like it. And then if you're religious, of course you can't use this argument in the public square, but if you're religious, you say that being has immediately upon the full human genome, which will become, that full human being, God infuses a supernatural, self-reflective soul that's going to allow it to be transcendent. It's going to allow it to survive bodily death, allow this person to this embryo to survive bodily death, and of course to be free and self-reflective and moral and empathetically loving. So for all intents and purposes, I mean, the reality is absolutely determinable. Why? We have DNA sequencers right now. There's no question that single-celled embryo is a human, unique human being, could be nothing other than a human being, and if allowed to develop without interference, will become a fully developed human being, manifesting all the dimensions of the soul that I just talked about.
Right.
So for all intents and purposes, I mean, the Catholics, are the ones that are trying to keep people, literally embedded in the real world. I think that the idea of using appearances as a way of judging things, is just, it's not just subjectivism, it's foolhardy. It can't do anything. It can't possibly be objective. It can't, you certainly can't build a bridge on it. You can't shoot a rocket at the moon on the basis of appearances. You better get some objective reality, not just in the sciences and in engineering, but in the political order as well, where lives are at stake, culture is at stake, family is at stake. We have to be able to do this, and of course, it is incumbent upon us as Catholics to, as they say, help people to get real again, and to just move out of this domain of
thinking of what you just said strikes me in the sense of the idea of building your house on a rock versus building your house on sand. It seems like we've decided that the sandy beach looks better than the rock we're on, and we're building our house, as we see fit on this sand that just falls apart. But it looks good, but it doesn't sustain.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, appearances, they do shift. I mean, that's another huge problem. I mean, let's suppose, even just with respect to my subjective identity, part of my subjective identity, part of my identity is not subjective. It's objective, right? You have, your gender is objective, right? Your abilities, vis-a-vis your athleticism. Some people are going to have more, some people less. Some people are going to be more analytical, some less. Some people are going to be more literary, some less. Some are going to be more musical, some less. Now, this, for all intents and purposes, you can't just say, no, I'm a good musician, even when you're a horrible one, and try and make yourself into, as it were, by sheer dint of will, you're going to make yourself into
but you'll just remember,
that's really.
Today you get a participation trophy anyway, so that would be what. So it'd be okay, regardless of your ability to play or not play. You get a participation trophy, and we're going to take a break right now. On that point, we're talking about hierarchies of truth, and certainly, if somebody ever heard me play an instrument, they understand that that's true. We're going to take a break. Be back with much more, talking with Father Spitzer about moral values and the hierarchy of those truths for a Catholic to consider. Stay with us. And we continue here in Father Spitzer's universe, the intersection of faith and reason, talking about, is there a hierarchy of truth in the moral order? And certainly there is, and certainly for Catholics, there is one to consider, especially this time of the year. We're speaking here with Father Spitzer from our studios at Christ Cathedral in beautiful Orange County, California. And Father, we have a question that came to us via email.
Sure.
Can you help me decide how I should vote? I heard a quote from the previous Pope, Pope Benedict, and we just mentioned that, and the Knights of Columbus. Carl Anderson, Supreme Knight, made a powerful speech. But what about the focus of the justice and the message of peace and justice? This seems to be a tough call this year for American Catholics, and we're kind of talking about that hierarchy of truth, about looking at things sometimes put together, I think using the phrase, let's say, the seamless garment, that all of these life issues are all related to one another. And I think the answer is that's true, but there's a way it can be misused, right?
Right. I mean, the first thing is you don't want to make a blur of all of these issues. And sometimes people just say, well, you can't rank values. Well, as I was just saying in the previous segment, you actually can rank values, and you can actually rank evils on the basis of the three criteria I talked about. Number one, ontological superiority. So, for example, killing a person is more evil than maiming a person, or killing a person is more evil than enslaving a person. Because of course at least there's life left, etc. So you can do it on the basis of ontological superiority. You can also rank values on the basis of whether something is an intrinsic evil or not an intrinsic evil. And of course, there's so many areas, right? I mean, I don't care which area we bring up with respect to peace and justice, with respect to being good stewards of the environment, with respect to the economy, with respect to immigration, with respect to all of the other issues about which the social encyclicals have been written. Now, the principles behind the social encyclicals are taught infallibly. However, the problem is when you get to the level of action, which action will actually bring about those the principles of what we call the social order. And of course, it's very, very difficult to say, what are the good consequences? What are the bad consequences, right? It's very, very difficult to say. Who's right about the economy? Who's right about health care? I mean, sometimes, some people, you can get very good people on one side of the coin saying you have to give health care to everyone right now who needs it, by this kind of a plan that funds it through debt. Okay, so you're going to fund it through indebtedness. And you get another very good person who will say in the same breath, if you keep funding it through debt, then the future generation isn't going to have health care because, of course, once you surpass a certain amount of debt, right? So we're, very critical point already with trillions of dollars of debt. I think 18 trillion or so. I mean, if we keep going at it, but once you get to the devaluation of a currency, that would be very bad for a future generation, and that would be a bad effect. And so they're looking at it from a different perspective. But can you actually say that one perspective is superior to another perspective? I just don't think that's possible to do because the perspectives are different in what's called the how. Right? I mean, the objectives, you have to have the objective of providing health care for those who cannot afford it. But the hows of doing this, boy, oh boy, to try and evaluate those, and to say one is morally superior to another, virtually impossible. So how do we then make sense out of these things? I mean, we have to take a look first and foremost, are we talking about an issue that deals with an intrinsic evil or not? If it's abortion, you're going to have to make that a really important issue. Is peace and justice an issue? Yes, peace and justice is a hugely important issue. It could be so important that it could concern, right, a nuclear holocaust if you were not careful and so forth and so on. But to say that one candidate or another is going to create a nuclear holocaust, that's a very difficult determination to make. But of course, whether abortion is an intrinsic evil, that's true. Right on the face of it, what we call prima facie, it is true. But of course, on the other hand, peace and justice is a principle to be aspired to. There are many strategies to getting to peace and justice, and we have to intend to get there, right? Because that's what our church is asking us to do. But at the very same moment, it's very difficult to know which strategy, which how is going to be the best way, which candidate has the best approach is much more difficult to determine than, let's say, whether abortion is an intrinsic evil. Right. And so that's one thing you can do to kind of start straightening out the mess.
Right.
Which things are intrinsic evils, which things are not intrinsic evil, which things have ontological superiority and which ones don't. Now, I'm not saying that justice is not important, but life is really important because, right, without life, justice is meaningless, right? Justice is conditioned upon, the human life, existing and being allowed to exist. So you can say, for example, the most fundamental principle of justice must always be to protect the lives of the innocent. Now, you're not going to get any question about this. That is the most fundamental principle of justice, is actually the protection of life. So justice and life in this case, they're not opposed to one another. They're consistent with one another. And you can even go further with respect to this and talk about, whether or not justice in this particular case, in the protection of life, what does it come down to? We call it the principle of non-maleficence. That is to say, the silver rule. Now, the silver rule is it's the one with the knots in it. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Don't do a harm, a negative to others that you don't want done to you. Now that's called ethical minimalism. That's called the principle of non-maleficence. And we'll see in a moment why it's the most fundamental principle in justice. But there's the golden rule. Now Jesus takes the knots out of the principle of non-maleficence and he turns it into what's called the principle of beneficence. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do the good for others that you would want done unto you. The sky's the limit, right? I mean, there are a zillion goods that we want that go far, far beyond the avoidance of harms to us, right? So Jesus has opened the door for altruism, and his principle of beneficence must include the principle of non-maleficence, right? The first order of the day, if you're going to be beneficent, the first order of the day, if you're going to do the good for another, is to not do them harm, and certainly not do them unnecessary harm, and certainly not do them unnecessary grave harm, like killing them. So, of course, when you get right down to it, does abortion have, as it were, this tremendous force, of prohibition against it on the basis of the principle of non-maleficence? Absolutely it does, because of course it's the unnecessary killing of a human being who is innocent, right? They haven't done anything, to have any of their rights abrogated in any way, and it's the unnecessary killing of that human being. Unquestionably, it is a human being. And so for all intents and purposes, you can see, well, if we're going to pursue justice, we have to first pursue the first order of justice, and the first order of justice is life, the protection of innocent life. And of course, the protection of all life, right? I mean, that's going to be absolutely important, in the just order. And of course, then we can move to other injustices, right? Like injustices against liberty, injustices against property, which would be poverty, right? And of course, liberty injustices are far worse than poverty injustices, right? Because of course, when you're enslaving people, when you're controlling their minds, et cetera, these are harms that prevent any kind of human flourishing from occurring. Whereas poverty, it's terrible, right? We have to be absolutely concerned about poverty, but we also have to have a ranking of justice. We have to, and of course, the ranking of rights is the ranking of justice, because an inalienable right is what is required, right, to make any human being flourish as a human being. They should have the rights of life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson is right. And they have that intrinsic to themselves, just as human beings. When they're born into the world as human beings, it belongs to them because they deserve minimum justice. And minimum justice is, of course, life first, liberty second, and a modicum of property to be able not to be an indentured servant, and finally the ability to pursue some form of happiness or opportunity.
And it's interesting too, because you mentioned Jefferson and and Adams, and those some of those races back then were pretty wild and woolly as well. We think things are so terrible today,
yes,
which they are, but they were pretty tough stuff back then. One of the quotes Cardinal Dolan from New York had written last week in Catholic New York in his column. He said, and Pope Francis has warned us against a throwaway culture where human life is cheap, the dignity of the person ignored, because all that counts is my convenience, desires, urges, pleasures, and self-willfulness. And I think that's important, because in certainly the Holy Father has talked great about, in a sense, the things peace and justice people would tend to focus on. But again, that priority there, if you're not born, you can't explore these other aspects of your life because you're not here. The other question I have for you, and this is maybe a little off, but how do we deal in a relativistic world. So maybe that's why the word fair has become so popular, because isn't fair totally relativistic?
Well, it could be, but fair is just basically another word for just or equitable, right? And there are ways of objectifying justice, equity, and therefore fairness. Now, fair is a loosier, goosier term than equitable or justice, but still, if justice and equity are subject to rankings and to are subject to objective assessment, then fairness should be too. But the way that we use fairness today, right, would mean I didn't get what I wanted. That's not fair. So that becomes, instead of an objectively grounded view of fairness, right, life first, liberty second, property third, opportunities for happiness fourth, right, instead of that, you basically say, well, if I didn't get what I wanted, it's not fair, right? That is a purely subjectivistic view of fairness, and in that case, yeah, that term is worthless as a criterion of assessment for anything. So for all intents and purposes, you just have to be careful how you use it and make sure that you're trying to use the word fair with some objective criterion to back it up.
Right.
And what do you mean by fair?
Right, and that's, I guess, how I was thinking in terms of the way it gets thrown around, because everything becomes a function of what's fair, and then a lot of that is dependent upon your criteria, how you evaluate that, and to understand what do you mean by the word fair. Hopefully, I like to say we always want to be good rather than fair, but that's another story.
Right.
Here's your next question, Father. As we're moving along, let's get another one in. After the issue of human life, we've talked about that a lot. What are the next most important issues that a Catholic should consider when voting? How should a Catholic examine their conscience and their candidate before making their vote? So again, in some ways, I think human life is the issue that ultimately rolls through everything that's important, isn't it? In a lot of ways.
Yes, it is. But once you have settled on human life as the highest priority, then of course you have to start looking at the next set of liberty rights, that need to be fulfilled, and it's something that this country has done very well. But again, the idea of liberty has always been a qualified view of liberty. So of course you're not going to have unqualified liberty in John Locke's system, right? As John Locke said, my freedom to swing my arm, stops where your face begins, right? I can't be, swinging my arm around with unlimited liberty. It's always going to be conditioned by what? The liberties and the rights of somebody else, by the life and injury of somebody else. So I'm always going to have to take a look at that. But yes, we have to make sure that every one of our citizens has those liberty rights, where they can not only practice their own religion, they can not only practice, or have, custody over their own, domicile, and most importantly, that they have the right to raise their family in a way that is commensurate with their religion, their values, their principles, their ideals, right? So we want to make sure that those freedoms exist, and that not only will an individual not interfere with those liberty rights, but Big Brother, the state, will not interfere with those liberty rights. And we should not think for a moment, right? I mean, obviously, the Founding Fathers were very aware of states that were brutal and were trying to dominate, the rights of human beings, the liberty rights of human beings, vis-a-vis religion, vis-a-vis family, vis-a-vis values, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, because of that, our country was almost discovered and founded, on the basis of that principle. So we want to make sure that we protect those things, and we want to make sure that those rights, those liberty rights exist, for each citizen, right, independently of state interference or state coercion. And there's a great deal of that, which is in the offing right now. I mean, we see it, I think, in the educational system, right, where parents don't have, in some areas, public education areas, don't have real custody over what their kids are learning. You can always say, well, you ought to go to a private school then, or go to a homeschool environment then. I would say yes, because they're left with no alternative, but there is a coercion in there. I don't have to say either that, there's coercions like with the Little Sisters of the Poor that are taking place on a really fantastic level. I mean, I can't remember a time, when people actually wanted to abrogate religious liberty to the point of forcing a woman's religious order,
Right.
to actually provide for things which they consider to be intrinsically evil. I mean, it's unbelievable. So Big Brother is alive and well,
Right.
and so we want to make sure that those liberty rights are protected for every citizen, and to make sure
Well said.
that exactly.
Right, and
and of
that's,
course, then we get into the.
That's gonna. We have not at the liberty to go for another hour. We have to wrap up right now. So we have to abide by certain rules and regulations that were put forth by Mother Angelica in her wisdom of starting EWTN. And next week we're going to be talking more about the whole idea of voting as a Catholic with your conscience, how a Catholic should go about voting. And I think we'll have some more interesting questions by then. So we'll see you then, Father. Great to see you, and we'll see you next week. And we invite everybody to remember that EWTN has a wonderful website with all this pro-life information. It's www.ewtn.com. You just go there and you find our website /vote. Are you prepared to vote? And don't forget that you can watch encores of the program. Go to ewtn.com and find out when we're on. Also on Saturdays, we're on radio as well, so a lot of people are interested in that. And I think actually soon to be on Friday nights as well, so check that out as well. And we shall see you next time when we re-enter this universe and talk more about Catholic voting. I'm Doug Keck. Thanks for joining us.